Hey everyone, Sinix here. Let's make some silly anime art. Anime Expo happens to be this weekend, and I shall again be joining up with the Jetty Jet Show and Ross Draws in the exhibit hall. We'll be at exhibit booth 316, so be sure to come by and say hi if you're attending. Anyway, in a mad scramble to make some new art for this occasion, I have decided to make a painting of Mercy from Overwatch in her lovely witch outfit. I threw together a bunch of quick thumbnail ideas, and this is the one I decided to go with. I always struggle a bit transitioning back and forth between realistic art and stylized art. Luckily, I had Jet around to give me some good suggestions on how to bump up the anime levels. Some of the facial features were adjusted, most notably the mouth was made a lot smaller. The boobs were also animified away from my more realistic version, and I definitely agree with his recommendations wholeheartedly, so thank you Jet, and it's always wonderful to have an artist friend around to be able to bounce ideas off of. So go make friends. Alright, let's get to work. The first thing I had to do was add in more of the costume details into the line work. Most anime art relies heavily on using clean and polished line work in the finished art, and I considered making the lines really nice, but I just couldn't handle the tedium of it, so I'll leave them a bit sloppy instead and just paint them out for the most part. Moving on to colors, I'll be doing the standard flat color approach to get things started. I do recommend starting off with a mid-tone in the background to let your eyes make better color decisions on the form, preferably less saturated than this purpley one I have here. One useful thing to keep in mind when trying to achieve either realism or anime art is that the skin tones in anime art tend to be very high value, whereas a realistic skin tone will usually be much closer to the mid-value range. Once the base colors are finished, I can pick a light source and fill in some shadows. I'm going to do this on an overlay layer, and the most important thing is that you're not just using a darker, colorless tone for this. Pick a hue that will help you reach your goals. I'm using a warmish purple color for all of my shadows, and that is a pretty common type of color to use for shading. It's right about in the middle of what most people normally pick. If you wind up happy with that, you can start rendering away. I like to start with the face while my energy levels are still high. Anime slims down a lot of aspects of realism, but that doesn't mean that you can't hint at them. For instance, the middle area of the face is always the most red, so a quick pass of an airbrush can give you all the variation we need. I like to always saturate the break between the shadow and light as well. This creates a much more lifelike feel to everything. When picking a color for the whites of the eyes, remember to not actually pick white. Just go slightly lighter and slightly cooler than the surrounding skin tone. Since these eyes are in shadow, I have to pick a reasonably dark value to represent the brightness of the eyes. I'm trying not to over-render, so all the other facial features are just getting some very controlled amount of color and detail. On the forehead, you may notice a slight cooling and lightening off of the shadow as it goes further away from the light. This is meant to simulate some level of bounced light, but honestly, I just think it's a really appealing aesthetic. Try having all of your hard shadows be darkest next to the highlights and then fading to a lighter desaturated tone as the shadow moves farther away from the light. It's just a suggestion, but you might really like the effect. Things get pretty slow and repetitive from here on out. The best thing to pay attention to is that every dark crevice and line area is usually a good spot to throw in some saturation on your dark colors. A lot of the black lines on the skin and hair are replaced with deep red tones. Once again, it's just more lively and avoids things from looking too muddy or dirty. When you're approaching different materials, such as fabric or metal, the most important thing to be mindful of is your value range. Every type of material has a different level of reflectivity and therefore value range. Highly matte materials, such as her witch hat, have an extremely small and subtle value range. If we had some shiny chrome jewelry or something, that would represent the complete opposite. As I render out the boobs a bit, hopefully you can notice just how effective it is to use these dark saturated red tones for showing skin tones with complex forms. Boobs are actually really good for painting practice, so paint them often. You have my permission. Nothing too interesting to mention about the rest of the skin stuff. I'm just going to zoom further along, and this also happens to be after I took a break to go sleep. I always recommend not painting something in just one sitting. You need fresh eyes, so I came back the next day and fixed a lot of minor things that were off. The crease in skin in the hip area was a bit low, and those lines in the hair were a bit nonsensical, and the head was looking a bit large too. All of these things were adjusted, and it's important to mention I was completely fine with the size of her head during the sketch phase. It was just the more realistic rendering of the materials that demanded her head be slightly closer to realistic. Not too much, of course, but that is actually a common issue. It's harder to get away with more stylized proportions if the rendering begins to look a little too realistic. And this isn't even very realistic. Anyway, the grind was real at this point. It's all just going to be piece by piece rendering each section out, so I might as well give a couple tips for dealing with long stretches of painting. The hopefully obvious thing is to make sure you stand up and stretch your legs every hour. Be sure to do wrist stretches as well. Personally, I find it very helpful to listen to music when painting, and I have heard that some people argue that efficiency and concentration go down when you listen to music, but in my opinion, that's a good thing. A constant distraction of your focus might make you a bit slower in the short term, but I find the mental distraction prevents you from getting worn out as fast. It's just less strain overall, which means you can work longer. In that same spirit, I find that constantly squinting at the screen to check values and balance has the added side benefit of reducing your eye strain. Eye strain is usually generated from focusing your eyes too long at one distance. Squinting does unfocus your eyes a bit, and for some reason I don't seem to get much eye strain when I'm working at art. I've been saying it for years, art is 10% skill and 90% squinting. Of course, the downside is you turn into one giant wrinkle. Maybe that's the true test of knowing how good of an artist someone is just by their appearance. A true artist is always just a mess of ligaments and wrinkles. At least I'm just going to tell myself that to make me feel better. By the way, I'm curious to hear any suggestions you guys might have for future fan art pieces. Overwatch characters are always fun to draw just because so much thought and care went into each of the designs, but I'm always curious to see what you guys would recommend. I honestly make very little finished art, so it would be nice to get into a routine of making actual art pieces. I sometimes feel like an athlete that spends all their time training and never actually competes, and then just retires and starts teaching PE. Oh no. Alright, how's this painting coming along? I really like how she has a bunch of detail elements in her costume that gradiate from a fiery red into a pale yellow. It's fun to paint. I think I got a bit lazy with painting the hands, but luckily she has gloves on, so I can just fake it a bit. The bulk of this painting was of course done with the Corel Painter dry brush, but I actually used a basic hard-edged opacity brush and an airbrush much more than normal. It is completely worth mentioning that this dry brush does make some things super easy, such as the wood on her Healy stick, but there's nothing really important here that can't be achieved using any old brushes. Originally, I had thought about doing some sort of giant moon/midnight background, but when I looked online, it seems as if every artwork of Witch Mercy had a similar background, so instead, I'm going to keep things light and simple. I'm ready to start wrapping things up, so we just have to add those wings back in. It's important to let your graphical design sense dictate the position and function of the wings. Just bend reality to your will if you have to. It's better to have an appealing composition with an inaccurate wing instead of the inverse. The wings also get to incorporate some of those bright orange accents, which I appreciate. I could have left it with just the hardware, but I might as well go all out and add those energy projected feather shapes also. All of this bright energy seems like the perfect excuse for some rim lighting. Of course, any excuse for rim light is a good excuse. I'm going to lay in a strong yellow rim light along her left side. The color theme of this image is definitely blue and yellow. Always be looking to constantly balance cool tones and warm tones, so the blue background further enhances the yellow light. A quick pop of glow brush can make it shine even brighter. It might be a bit overboard, but I also decided to balance the rim light with a cool secondary rim light on the opposite side. Yeah, I know, double rim light, I dared to dream. That's going to pretty much do it for the painting. I added some floaty yellow glowy bits to create some life and movement, and for the sake of this being for Anime Expo, I even threw in a little bit of Japanese text as a graphic element. Somewhat silly? Maybe, but it's fun. So that's the finished result. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to meet some of you at Anime Expo this weekend. Remember, Exhibit Booth 316. Cheers everyone, and a big thank you to all of my patrons for helping to bring about all of these videos. See ya.